Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Now, as you may know, global news organizations, including Arise News, are still working assiduously to try to get a clearer picture of what exactly is going on in the northern Ethiopian region of Tigray. The Ethiopian federal government launched an attack to take the capital Mekele, and it says the leaders of the Tigray region, the TPLF, have fled. Meanwhile, the TPLF say they're continuing to fight near Mekele and say they have shot down an Ethiopian warplane. And as we have constantly mentioned in our broadcasts on Ethiopia, a media blackout means it's almost impossible to get accurate information from inside Tigray.
The defense force has not killed a single person in any city. No nation's military could have shown better competency than us. We are very disciplined, heroic soldiers. There have been campaigns saying you are going to destroy Mekele and so on. Mekele is ours. It is built by our own wealth. How would we destroy it? During the Mekele operation, no harm was sustained by a single person. What the special force did was especially surgical.
Well, let's get the next best thing and speak to the Ethiopian political analyst and senior lecturer in law at the University of Keele in the UK, Dr. Awol Allo, who is himself Ethiopian. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's start with the military aspect of things and what you're hearing so far. What's the latest that you know about the state of the fighting in Tigray?
I think the state of play right now suggests that the conventional conflict between the federal government and the Tigray regional government has ended, and the conflict has now moved into a different phase, which is an asymmetric guerrilla warfare. And that is the signal that we got from the leader of the Tigray regional government after the Ethiopian Prime Minister declared the war over.
And I mean, just to pick your brain further on that, on these claims by the TPLF that they shot down a federal warplane, is there any evidence to back that up? Because the TPLF on its regional television showed the face of someone it says is a captured pilot, and also a piece of a burning plane, which they say is a MiG-23. But of course, the federal government says it's all a lie.
It's true, and I think since the beginning of this war, we were really left to the propaganda that is put out both by the federal government and the Tigray regional government. There was a complete media blackout, no independent reporter. So it's really difficult to verify what is true and what is not true. Yes, you are absolutely right that there was a television footage that showed some burning fire and the face of a man that was purportedly the pilot of that plane. But you know, we don't know. It's very difficult to verify whether these allegations are actually true or not. But I think what we can be certain about is that although the Ethiopian government declared that the war is over, and I don't think the end of the conventional warfare as such means the end of war in the Tigray region, that this has now morphed into a guerrilla warfare where Tigrayan forces would likely continue to target the Ethiopian army and Ethiopian officials in the Tigray region.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because some have suggested that it is a bit early for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to have declared victory, because it does appear as if the TPLF still controls the regional television service and are broadcasting as usual. And shortly after the Prime Minister announced the completion of the military offensive on Saturday, the regional forces fired rockets into Eritrea and subsequently claimed the recapture of the historic town of Axum, but the federal government has denied those claims. So claims, denials, and counterclaims.
Absolutely, and I think that has been one of the, I think, constant features of this war from the very beginning. I think when I say that, it's reasonable to assume at this point that the conventional warfare is over, it's because the Tigray regional government itself said that they left the capital city of the region, that is Mekele, and moved to the mountains. And he very clearly stated that the war, the struggle for the right to self-determination would continue. I think what that means is that once you have left your space that you occupy as a regional government and you are fighting not from the center as a government, but as some kind of quasi or non-state actor, that changed the nature of the conflict. Until the Tigray regional government left Mekele, I think that conflict for me is a conventional conflict where you have a regional government that is in effective control of its territory and controls large swaths of territory and have significant access to weaponry, launching a concerted attack against the central government. That is a conventional military conflict that I think since they left the capital, it is very difficult to consider it as such. So we don't know the scale, the intensity of the fighting that is happening at the moment to judge whether it is really a kind of guerrilla conflict proper. But I think that is the territory in which we are operating at the moment, not the conventional kind of confrontation at the that existed at the beginning.
Well, it sounds like you're saying that the conflict is continuing, albeit as a guerrilla sort of war, a sort of, continuing insurrection. But I wonder if I can just ask you about international pressure, because the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeted that he's spoken with Abiy Ahmed and urged a complete end to the fighting in Tigray and called for the start of dialogue and safe, unhindered humanitarian access. Is it your sense that that is real substantial international pressure that would have an impact on the course of this conflict?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the international community, or so-called international community, is a very transactional institution or set of institutions and arrangements where they intervene only when certain set of circumstances are in place. So yes, there has been, I think, concerted pressure, particularly on the part of European countries, on the Ethiopian government, demanding that the government provides access to civilians and humanitarian resources. Europeans have gone even further, threatening the Ethiopian government with aid withdrawal. The Europeans also took the matter to the United Nations Security Council, making it difficult for the United States to remain silent. And of course, the Secretary of State a couple of days ago tweeted after speaking to the Prime Minister that he has urged for the conflict to end and for negotiations to resume. So the international community, more or less, depending on the kind of geopolitical interest they have on Ethiopia, you could say they have done reasonably okay. But I think if there is one community of states that betrayed Ethiopians in this particular situation, is the African Union. The African Union essentially provided what you may, possibly describe as a cover for the Ethiopian government by thwarting the ability of the Security Council to consider the matter, and also by not really putting real pressure on the Ethiopian government. So, international pressure usually when it comes to conflicts that are internal depends on a host of circumstances, but primarily states consider their own national interest and also their geopolitical interest. So what we have so far is, I think, a reasonably good pressure on the Ethiopian government. We'll see whether the government will, positively respond to those or not. But, at the end of the day, this is a conflict that is fundamentally political and ideological in nature. There can be no military solution for these kinds of conflict. And Ethiopia, now that the conventional war is over, and I think the central government has shown that it can defeat a small regional government, it is time now, I think, to move forward, sit down around the table and address this fundamental political problem. The problem is not simply with the regional government of Tigray, it's much broader, much larger, and the only way forward for the Ethiopian state is an all-inclusive national dialogue where, some of the most outstanding political questions in that country would be debated and agreed and finally tabled to the Ethiopian people so that the Ethiopian public can decide what kind of future they want.
Well, that's a very interesting analysis, and I'd like to drill down further on that when we come back from a break. But I just wonder, for you, on a personal level, Dr. Allo, I wonder how difficult this conflict in Ethiopia is for you personally. I mean, you are an ethnic Oromo, which is the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's ethnic group. I wonder if you know people in Tigray and how those people might be getting on.
Yeah, Ethiopia is a country with a very complex history. It is an empire of multiple ethnic groups who are held together by force, and the way in which these ethnicities are held together by force is usually along the lines of discriminations and a marginalization that takes ethnicity as its point of departure. So, Oromos are the largest ethnic group in the country, but also at the same time, one of the most marginalized, culturally subordinated, and economically deprived communities. So, over the last several years, the Oromos have been fighting against the central government that was controlled by the Tigray People's Liberation Front. You remember, you and I talked about the Oromo protests between 2015, November to 2018. It was that relentless popular protest that actually brought Abiy Ahmed to power. So the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which is now fighting against the government of Abiy Ahmed, was the party that dominated Ethiopian politics, particularly repressed the Oromos when they were on power. Now, the situation has changed so dramatically, and I think what is so sad at the moment is the fact that the country has plunged into an armed military confrontation that simply deepens what is already a very fragile, very fractious, very explosive political situation. And I wish the country didn't go to war. I wish we have managed to solve these political differences through dialogue and negotiations. It's very difficult to do so, particularly when you are dealing with very stubborn forces who dominated the country's economy, the country's politics, its security apparatus. But still, I expected the Prime Minister, particularly as a Nobel Peace winner, to rule out the possibility of going to war to solve what is a fundamentally political problem. So it's a very sad situation that we see. Connected to this, there is a significant level of ethnic profiling of Tigrayans that is happening now, particularly in the capital city, in Addis. And I think what this does is really harm the ability of the Prime Minister to advance his own nation-building agendas. If you are to create a state that works for everybody in a highly heterogeneous and multicultural society like Ethiopia, it's important that you avoid at all costs a situation like this that would leave behind a scar that is very difficult to heal. A lot of Tigrayans that I speak to today say that Ethiopia for them is over. They see themselves as Tigrayans and Tigrayans only. And I think it's understandable why people feel the way they feel.
Okay. Please stay with us. Dr. Allo would like to very much talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the conflict between Ethiopia's federal government and the northern region of Tigray. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. In Ethiopia, fighters of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, have been reportedly seen trying to regroup outside the city of Mekele just days after losing the state capital. That's according to the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who just days earlier had declared the conflict over. The head of the TPLF has said his forces will fight on, indicating the conflict might not be completely over. Prime Minister Abiy claims that the TPLF fighters who fled Mekele are in his sights. He said the federal army didn't attack because the retreating TPLF fighters had their families and abducted soldiers with them. Hundreds are believed to have been killed from both sides since fighting began 4 weeks ago. But Mr. Abiy said no civilians had been killed by his troops. But since the federal government has imposed a widespread communications shutdown, that claim is impossible to independently verify. And with me via WebEx, the Ethiopian political analyst and senior lecturer in law at the University of Keele in the UK, Dr. Awol Allo, who is, of course, an Ethiopian national himself. Thank you very much indeed for your patience and for staying with us. Did you see this conflict coming, or was there an incident that suddenly happened and triggered and escalated the situation?
No, the conflict was completely foreseeable. I think a lot of us have been saying that the political differences within the country, the ideological differences, particularly differences in terms of the vision that different actors have for the future of Ethiopia, seemed so irreconcilable that those differences have been generating a lot of tensions, a lot of contradictions that are not necessarily related to the ideological differences themselves, but very much flow from that. There isn't even a very clear recognition by different actors that those differences, those contradictions are related to the different visions those actors have for the country. And it was very clear that a series of events took place since the Prime Minister came into office in April of 2018, the likelihood of a significant breakdown of law and order, and ultimately the escalation of some of these conflicts into a full-blown military confrontation was quite foreseeable. And both sides, in my view, have been preparing for that eventuality because they realize that the only way, apparently, to solve this problem is through a military means.
But in terms of the immediate trigger that led to the escalation of this situation, there is that allegation that the Tigray leadership had worked in concert with the Oromo region to carry out a massacre in West Walaika. Is that right?
I think I missed what you said. Could you repeat that question? There was some connection issues.
Okay, what I was saying, and I hope you can hear me, is that in terms of the immediate trigger that escalated this situation into war, basically, the allegation is that the Tigray leadership had worked in concert with the Oromo region to carry out a massacre in a part of the country known as West Walaika. Is that right?
That's true, but the government did not actually present that event as the immediate trigger. What the government presented as sort of official trigger for the war is the decision by the Tigray regional government to take control of the northern command of the Ethiopian armed forces stationed in the Tigray regional state.
The next thing I was going to ask you was whether you, given all that you have said, including the continuing, what appears now to be a sort of guerrilla war that's going to be sort of prosecuted by the Tigrayans against the federal government, is this a winnable war in the final analysis for either side, especially when the regional government, which is fighting the central government, has considerable resources and battle experienced fighters?
I think that is the key here. it's very easy to go into war without really assessing the long-term consequences of what an armed conflict of this nature does to your effort to build a new nation. Ethiopia is, as I was saying earlier, a country with a history of empire. There are relationships of inequality and domination that defined the nature and the character of the Ethiopian state. The Prime Minister says that he is committed to creating a unified Ethiopia. In my view, the way he approached this is highly problematic. But even if one assumes that he is genuine in what he says, the war significantly undermines his own ability to achieve that goal of unifying Ethiopia in the way he understands unity. So this is bound to be a protracted military stalemate that would, I think, turn the Tigray regional state and adjacent region into a battleground for insurgency. And coupled with significant security and political challenges that the country is facing in other parts of the country, particularly in Oromia and likely in other parts of the region going forward, that is going to create a significant problem. So the country, instead of focusing on its developmental challenges or on some serious structural issues that need addressing, would have to deal with that insurgency, and government resources and government effort, energy would be squandered on dealing with that military problem. And it also, I think, changed the regional dynamics in terms of the relationship that regional states have with Ethiopia. Although, right now it appears as if the federal government does have a very good relationship with regional governments, this would change. This would change particularly in terms of, for example, Ethiopia's relation with Sudan, Ethiopia's relation with South Sudan, the differences between Ethiopia and Egypt on the construction and operation of the dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. All of those are significant geopolitical issues that would impact the way in which this conflict plays out over the next years or more. So there is really nothing, positive or nothing to celebrate about Ethiopia's victory over one of its own region, because this does not end the war in the strict sense of the term. The war would simply morph into a guerrilla, long-running asymmetric warfare. This particular community in Ethiopia has fought a guerrilla warfare against the Derg government, which was at the time one of the largest armies in Africa, and they won. Now the geopolitical context in the region has changed significantly, and Ethiopia of today is not Ethiopia of the 1970s and 1980s, but there are still ample material on the ground that enables this region to continue to fight an insurgency that would destabilize the Ethiopian state. It would also make it simply difficult for the government to focus on other most important issues, which then encourage other regions with their own questions, with their own resentment against the Ethiopian state to make the same demands. And ultimately, it's just destabilizing for Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa region.
Dr. Awol, I want to thank you very much indeed for the time you've given us. Dr. Awol Allo is the Ethiopian political analyst and senior lecturer in law at the University of Keele in the UK. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and London, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.